Well, welcome everyone. It's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Mary Cunningham for today. And she's a great expert on Byzantine homilies, and especially on homilies on the Virgin Mary. And she's going to talk about one of the homilies on the Virgin Mary, a particularly important one for the history of the lives of the Virgin. Well, without any more delay, let me pass over to Mary. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you all for attending this talk. And it's a great honor to be part of this series with such eminent speakers. I've really enjoyed listening to many other talks and learning a great deal. So what I wanted to talk about today is a text which I translated recently. Sebastian just called it a homily, and that is probably how it is indicated in the manuscripts, but I would actually call it a life. But first of all, it's a life or a hagiography of the Virgin Mary written in the early 9th century by a monk called Epiphanios. So what I'm going to do now first is share my screen, and I hope this will work. Is everyone seeing my PowerPoint? Yes, oh
Yes.
good. Okay, so who was Mary, the woman who conceived and gave birth to Jesus Christ, and who in subsequent centuries became such an important focus of veneration in her own right? The epistles of Paul and the four Gospels, which form part of the collection of writings that we know as the New Testament, are generally rather reticent about the Virgin Mary. She features in the first 2 chapters of the Gospel of Luke and makes some important appearances in that of John. Nevertheless, the evangelists don't provide any details about Mary's ancestral heritage, her childhood and education, or even very much about her activities during Christ's ministry, passion, and resurrection. Post-apostolic writers, including Ignatius of Antioch and Irenaeus of Lyon, recognized the theological significance not only of the Virgin's miraculous and highly mysterious conception and birth of Christ, but also of her voluntary acceptance of this act, which reversed the disobedience of her female ancestor Eve. And at about the same time, that is in the course of the 2nd century, the intriguing text that is known as the Protevangelium of James was composed. This work provides an account of Mary's miraculous birth from a sterile but well-born Jewish couple, Joachim and Anna, her dedication to the temple at the age of 3, betrothal to Joseph when she reached puberty, and the rest of the story regarding the Annunciation and Nativity of Christ. It's not known whether the author of the Protevangelium had access to true facts about the Virgin Mary's origins. Scholars generally interpret this text as a theological narrative that seeks to prove her purity and spiritual preparation for conceiving and giving birth to Christ, the Son and Word of God. Further texts, many of which provided accounts of the events leading up to Mary's death and assumption into heaven, began to circulate in Eastern Christendom from about the late 5th century onward. These so-called Dormition accounts were, like the Protevangelium of James, gradually accepted into mainstream Christian tradition. Feast days were introduced into the liturgical calendar to celebrate events in the Virgin's life, including her nativity, entrance into the temple, and Dormition. The apocryphal texts that told her history were read out, as far as we can determine, in liturgical settings, and used as inspiration for homilies and hymns. It's likely that these narratives were intended initially to convey the Christological message of Mary's holiness as the receptacle and birth-giver of the incarnate God. However, as interest and reverence for the Theotokos as a powerful figure in her own right developed over the Christian centuries, the texts that honored her began also to appeal to her role as intercessor and protector of all the faithful. I want to talk to you today, as I said earlier, about a hagiographical text that was composed in the late 8th or early 9th century by a monk and priest named Epiphanios, who may have belonged to the monastery of Kallistratos in Constantinople. According to the Greek manuscripts that contain this text, Epiphanius called it simply, quote, about the conduct of the supremely holy Theotokos, or God-bearer, and about the years of her life, unquote. This is a manuscript containing the life, which dates to the 11th century. You can see the life appears on the recto folio. If I use my pointer, Epiphaniou monachou presbyteru periton vion tis hyperaias Theotokou, etc. So that's his title, and the text, in fact, begins here. And it's in the Vatican Library, as you can see. The text survives in at least 40 manuscripts, which date from the 10th century onward. It appears to have been intended for oral delivery in one of the offices for a Marian feast day. According to Albert Erhardt, it is included in Middle and Late Byzantine liturgical collections for either of two feasts, the Virgin's Nativity, celebrated on the 8th of September, or her Dormition, on the 15th of August. The number of manuscripts suggests the relative popularity of Epiphanius's life of the Virgin in Byzantium. Such a conclusion is reinforced by its clear influence on a 10th century Marian life that is attributed to John Geometres. And this is a recent edition and translation of that life by Maximos Konstas and Christos Similidis. As you can see, it only came out last year and is very worth having. This later and much longer text adopts aspects of Epiphanius's narrative, but develops it further in both theological and panegyrical terms. One other aspect of Epiphanius's life, which I'll touch on in the course of this talk, is its influence on Western texts and images from about the 12th century onward. This is due to the fact that it was translated into Latin and circulated widely in the West, influencing such important sources as Jacob of Voragine's Golden Legend. I recently translated and commented on Epiphanius the monk's Life of the Virgin Mary, along with another hagiographical text that he composed on the Apostle Andrew. I'll be reading out some passages of my translation of the former text today in order to demonstrate what I see as the main preoccupations of this author when he compiled his Life of the Virgin. Epiphanius writes in his prologue to the work that he intends to provide a full account of Mary's life and death. He states that, quote, there have been many panegyrists of the Theotokos from among the Holy Fathers, but not one of them elaborated her life and times truly and accurately from her upbringing to her death, unquote. Simon Mimouni has commented that Epiphanius could not, in fact, have conceived the idea of writing a full-length Life of the Virgin out of the blue. We know, for example, on the basis of a few 5th or 6th century and 5th and 6th century Syriac manuscripts, that the Protevangelium of James, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and accounts of the Virgin Mary's death and Assumption into heaven were sometimes grouped together as if to provide complete coverage of her legendary life. I should also state here that whether or not Epiphanius the monk's Life of the Virgin represents the earliest Greek hagiographical text in her honor remains a matter of controversy. Michel van Esbroek and Stephen Shoemaker have strongly defended a 7th century date for a life that survives only in Georgian, and which is attributed in manuscripts to the great Byzantine theologian Maximus the Confessor. I don't intend to enter that debate today, except to say that, as Christos Similidis demonstrated in a recent article, the dependence of that life on the one by John Geometres, which I mentioned earlier, seems clear. I would add that both texts display a sophisticated Mariology that fits much better within a middle rather than an early Byzantine literary setting. However, leaving that question aside for the purposes of this talk, it's possible to reiterate that Epiphanius the monk at least saw himself as the first Greek hagiographer to compile a full-length biography of the Virgin Mary. He wrote the text for a mainly monastic audience, which was accustomed to honoring her memory and celebrating her feasts. It seems to me that 3 preoccupations emerge from Epiphanius the monk's Life of the Virgin Mary, and I'll be focusing on these for the rest of my talk. First, he's keen to demonstrate the Virgin's links with the rest of humanity and with her Jewish heritage. This, of course, reveals the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, which testified to the birth of the Messiah from a young Jewish girl, or in Greek, a virgin, that is proclaimed in Isaiah 7:14. However, it may also reflect recent Christological discussions in the context of the iconoclastic policies of 8th and 9th century Byzantine emperors. Iconophiles, or the defenders of holy images, emphasized the reality of Christ's incarnation, sometimes pointing to the humanity of his mother in order to make this point. Second, Epiphanius presents the Virgin Mary as a model of asceticism. Her pious behavior, which includes prayer, fasting, all-night vigils, and other disciplines, manifests itself especially during the childhood years that she spent in the Jewish temple and after Christ's resurrection and ascension into heaven, when she was, according to Epiphanius and earlier apocryphal writers, living in the house in Jerusalem that belonged to the evangelist John. It's likely that this aspect of the life was intended to instruct Epiphanius's largely monastic audience, although the ideals that he describes could also have been embraced by pious clergy and lay people. Third and finally, I would like to look briefly at the 9th century hagiographer's interest in demonstrating how close Mary remained to her divine Son throughout his ministry, passion, and resurrection. This preoccupation would be taken much further in the 10th century Lives of the Virgin. However, we can see seeds of it in the life by Epiphanius. He suggests that Mary accompanied Jesus on his travels through Judea and Galilee. When women such as Peter's mother-in-law or Mary Magdalene decided to join them, they became disciples of the Theotokos. Although Mary did not accompany the other myrrh-bearers to the tomb, according to Epiphanius, Christ appeared first to her after the resurrection, visiting her chamber in John's house, while Mary Magdalene was still speaking to the angels at the tomb, according to John 20:13. As you've probably gathered from these introductory observations, Epiphanius the monk adopted a dynamic approach towards both canonical scripture and apocryphal traditions about the Virgin Mary. If aspects of these narratives needed adjustment for the sake of his literary and theological purposes, he was prepared to adopt such changes. The narrative discrepancies between the 4 Gospels, which had always required explanation on the part of the Church Fathers, may have contributed to the hagiographer's freedom. However, the overriding reason for such a creative approach, in my view, was that he had a message, or several messages, to convey. So let's turn to the first of these, namely Epiphanius' desire to portray a fully human Virgin Mary. This preoccupation can be illustrated with the help of several passages in his life. First, it's noteworthy that Epiphanius includes a genealogy for this holy female figure. Whereas Matthew and Luke provide rather different genealogies for Christ in their respective Gospels, Christian exegetes had always been worried by the fact that these traced his ancestry back to David or beyond through his non-biological father, Joseph. It appears that attempts to provide a genealogy for Mary, through whom Jesus gained his genetic heritage, had begun in various literary contexts, including Syriac commentaries on the Diatessaron and Greek polemical texts. Epiphanius's version of the Virgin Mary's family tree is taken almost verbatim from John of Damascus's exposition of the Orthodox faith, a treatise that had been written in the first half of the 8th century. One of the features of this genealogy is that it traces Mary's roots through her parents, Joachim and Anna, to the tribe of Levi. That is, she was descended from both Davidic or royal and Levitical priestly branches of the Jewish race. The passage in which Epiphanius expounds this genealogy, which I've put up on the screen, is too long and technical to read out today. So you may have just been able to skim it just now, but I'm not going to read it out. Nevertheless, it represents an important link in the Greek transmission of ideas about Mary's, as opposed to Joseph's, genealogical background. Epiphanius also underlines the Virgin Mary's humanity by describing in detail her personal appearance. This passage in his life represents one of the first attempts in the Byzantine Greek theological tradition to provide such a description, so it's worth looking at it in detail. It appears in the context of Epiphanius' narrative about the Virgin's sojourn as a child in the Jewish temple, and it reads as follows, quote, "She was fair in coloring, with blonde hair, light-colored eyes that were well-shaped, black-browed, with a prominent nose, long hands, long-fingered, and with a narrow face filled with divine grace and beauty, without pride, unpretentious, active, and in possession of surpassing humility." This description, which has some, but as far as I'm aware, no conclusive parallels with contemporary iconography of the Virgin, stands on its own in early and middle Byzantine literature. One somewhat obscure source, namely an apocryphal text known as the Legend of Aphroditianus, may have inspired Epiphanius. However, it was unusual in the Greek Mariological tradition for her physical appearance to be described. It's possible that the iconoclastic controversy, during which our hagiographer lived and wrote his works, inspired interest in how the Virgin Mary, and above all her son Jesus Christ, might be depicted in man-made images. In addition to this, as I suggested above, iconophile theologians, beginning with John of Damascus, developed a polemical stance which claimed that in suppressing icons, the iconoclasts denied the reality of Christ's human incarnation. It was perhaps in response to this that Epiphanius the monk portrayed his mother, Christ's mother, the Virgin Mary, as a woman with physical and moral attributes that the faithful could picture and admire. I'd like to propose one other aspect of Epiphanius's interest in the humanity of the Theotokos, which appears in his willingness to manipulate the existing traditions about her life and death. Although the Protevangelium of James states clearly that the Virgin was taken into the temple at the age of 3 and betrothed to Joseph when she was 12, Epiphanios, alone among any Byzantine hagiographers or panegyrists that I've so far examined, changes her age at these important transitional points to 7 and 14. The most likely explanation for such adjustments to a well-entrenched legend, it seems to me, is that our hagiographer is endeavoring to add realism to the story from an, quote, historical point of view. What parents, after all, would relinquish a child to the care of the Jewish high priest at the age of 3? And is it not more realistic to picture the betrothal of Mary at the age of 14 rather than 12? This must remain only a hypothesis, but it fits in with Epiphanius' statement at the beginning of the life that he aims to recount Mary's story, quote, truly and accurately from her upbringing to her death, unquote. He goes on to calculate the number of years that she lived at the end of his text on the basis of unstated, perhaps oral or imaginary, sources concerning her life in Jerusalem after Christ's ascension into heaven. Epiphanius comes up with a total of 72 years for the Virgin Mary's earthly life in Galilee and Judea. The hagiographer also provides a narrative based on earlier sources, such as John of Thessaloniki's homily on the Dormition, of the Virgin's death and burial. However, he does not go into what happened after her assumption into heaven. He has a tendency to stick to terrestrial, believable, quote, facts, unquote, and I've deliberately put facts in inverted commas here, about the Virgin Mary, avoiding panegyrical or mystical elaboration of her story, such as we find in other early and later sources on her glorious afterlife, either in an earthly paradise or in heaven itself. To move on now to my second topic, which is Epiphanius' preoccupation with the Virgin Mary's asceticism, to the extent that she may serve as a model for female and male monastics at the time that he was writing. We find this receiving special emphasis at certain periods of her life. It's once again during Mary's sojourn in the temple, when she's nearing the age of puberty, that Epiphanius chooses to describe her way of life. He writes as follows, quote, she spun the threads for the holy things, that is, those that belong to the temple of the Lord, and was nourished from the temple, devoting herself to prayers, reading, fasting, handiwork, and every virtue, to the extent that the entirely holy Mary became a teacher of all women, by means both of the diversity of her works and her demeanor. After leaving the temple and moving into Joseph's house, Mary becomes the spiritual teacher of her betrothed husband's 2 daughters. Epiphanius writes, and she passed her life in Joseph's house with humility and piety. When she had spent 6 months there, fasting in the accustomed way until the 9th hour of the day, the archangel Gabriel, who was sent from God, revealed himself to her as she was praying. We notice here that Mary is following a rigorous monastic lifestyle, that is, according to 9th century practice, fasting until well after the middle of the day, when, according to Epiphanius, the Annunciation took place. Another point at which our hagiographer focuses on the Virgin's ascetic way of life occurs towards the end of the text, after he has described Christ's ascension into heaven. At this time, according to Epiphanius, Mary was living in the house on Zion that had been purchased by the evangelist John. This was also the site of the upper room where, according to tradition, the Last Supper Christ's appearance to Thomas and the other disciples after his resurrection, and Pentecost took place. In this section of the life, Epiphanius is concerned to show how, in Christ's absence, his mother Mary became a model and even a leader of the apostles. He writes as follows about this period in her life. The Theotokos, on seeing the ascension of her son into heaven, devoted herself even more to asceticism and genuflection, or literally the bending of the knees. And here Epiphanius quotes the famous preacher and hymnographer Andrew of Crete, who said, quote, "The indentations of her knees are visible even until now on the marble floors of holy Zion, along with the dent on the rock where she would take a natural sleep for a short time. She possessed honor and fear on the part of all human beings, as well as glory, not only from a faithful person, but also from a Jew and a Greek." Epiphanius goes on to say that the Virgin Mary performed miracles during this phase of her life. Quote, "accomplishing many cures, granting health to the sick, freeing those who were possessed by demons from these impure spirits, and performing acts of mercy and care for the poor, along with widows and orphans." Unquote. The image of a strong and powerful woman is taken even further more than a century later in John Geometry's Life of the Virgin. According to this writer, who was influenced by Epiphanius, Mary guided the apostles in their missions and acted as their spiritual mother, to the extent that, John writes, all the apostles and disciples had her as the center or root of their souls, and it was from her that they received their vital power when they set out. And if they had accomplished something or had failed in something, it was to her that they returned, and having once again been taught, encouraged, and at the same time corrected by her, they returned to the work of mission or service. We thus see the development of a Virgin Mary who is a strong, ascetic, and influential spiritual leader in Middle Byzantine hagiography. Both Epiphanius and John Geometries built this image on earlier models, which are visible in the Greek tradition since as early as the 3rd century, for example, in Origen's commentaries on the New Testament, but which had not so far been developed to this extent in Mariological discourse. I'd like to turn now to my third and final theme, which is the Virgin Mary's closeness throughout her life to her son Jesus Christ, according to Epiphanius the monk. This aspect of the narrative is not, in fact, as pronounced as it would become in the 10th century lives of the Virgin. However, I think that Epiphanius laid the foundations for what appears in these texts, beginning with that of John Geometries. After Jesus reached the age of 30 and was baptized, according to our 9th century hagiographer, he began his mission in Galilee and Judea. His mother, the Theotokos, remained with him at all times, although surprisingly, she's not mentioned in Epiphanius's version of the story of the marriage of at Cana. When women, including the disciple Peter's wife and mother-in-law, decided to leave their homes and follow Christ, they were assigned to the care and teaching of the Virgin Mary. Although Epiphanius does not emphasize Mary's presence at Jesus' trial, as John Geometries would later do, he does highlight her station at the foot of the cross, where Christ entrusted her to the care of the disciple and evangelist John, in accordance with the brief passage in John 19, 26 to 27. Epiphanius further describes the house on Zion, which, according to a long-standing apocryphal tradition, had been bought by the beloved disciple, and where he took the Virgin Mary after the ordeal at the cross had been completed. This was also the house where the disciples participated in the Last Supper, and where Christ appeared to them, along with Thomas after his resurrection, as I described before. Our hagiographer makes it clear that in his view, the Theotokos did not accompany the myrrh-bearing women to the tomb because, he says, she was laid up with unspeakable pain. He goes on to recount in a strand of the story that is, to my knowledge, unique to this text, that, quote, while the angel was speaking with Mary Magdalene at the tomb, Christ appeared first to his mother in the house of the theologian, that is, on Holy Sion. Thus, while remaining faithful to his realistic depiction of the Virgin, as I pointed out earlier in this talk, that is, in this case, portraying her as exhausted and incapacitated by her grief to the extent that she could not tend to her son's body in the tomb, Epiphanius could not resist having Christ appear first to her, as opposed to Mary Magdalene or any of the other disciples. Thus, he adjusted the narrative in order to squeeze in one extra visit to his mother in her private chamber in the house on Zion. This detail is not picked up in the 10th century Lives of the Virgin. They have her going to the tomb, reverting to previous tradition, perhaps. But I have noticed, and I'm not sure if art historians have commented on this, I've not found that they have, that the scene is depicted in several Middle Byzantine psalters, including the so-called Kludov and Barberini examples. This is the Kludov Psalter, which is dated to the 9th century, as you can see. And if you can see it, this is Christ on the left and Mary almost in the house, although somewhat on the roof. And I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit obscured on my screen. Sorry, I'll go back. But it does say, there's an inscription at the top saying Ia Sion to identify that house. And a little more clearly in the Barberini Psalter, you see in the image down on the right here, the lower half of the folio, Christ is appearing here on the right to Mary, who is in the house, and you can see the inscription Ia Sion above. And interestingly, Christ is standing on the tomb with Hades prostrate as a rather dark figure beneath his feet. To add a footnote to this passage, it's interesting to note the wide dissemination of the moment of Christ's appearance to the Virgin in the house of Zion in texts and later iconography in the West. Although I've not found this in mainstream monumental Byzantine art of a later period, but it did spread due to the translation of this life into Latin in the 12th century. And it's all over the place if you start looking in the iconography of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance of Christ appearing within a house to the Virgin Mary. I've given you a few examples here. And of course, this followed the translation, as I said, of the life, Epiphanius's life into Latin in the 12th century. And possibly, even more importantly, its influence on sources such as Jacob of Voragine's Golden Legend in the 13th century. I've focused on these perhaps somewhat meager examples in order to demonstrate how close Mary remained in her maternal relationship to Christ throughout both of their lives, according to Epiphanius the monk. I say meager because the theme is developed much further in the lives by John Geometres and by Euthemius the Athonite, the author of the life that survives only in Georgian in the 10th century. Both of these hagiographers, who were influenced to some extent by Epiphanius's life, but also went their own way in certain aspects of the narrative, but they all portrayed Mary at Christ's side, teaching and guiding her own female disciples, standing at the courtroom door as well as at the cross, and in their case, that is the 10th century hagiographers, attending the tomb with the other myrrh bearers. The theme elevates the Virgin to a position of considerable importance in the life, ministry, passion, and resurrection of Christ. Indeed, after his resurrection, according to all these Middle Byzantine lives of the Virgin, Mary became the model, guide, and leader of the small band of Jesus's followers and apostles in Jerusalem, as we saw earlier. So to conclude, my purpose today has been to show how a rather obscure 9th century Constantinopolitan hagiographer used canonical and apocryphal sources to interpret the legend of the Virgin Mary in a new, and in his view, more realistic way. As he states in his prologue, Epiphanios intends to provide mainly monastic readers with a narrative that covers Mary's terrestrial life from start to finish. Unlike some earlier apocryphal writers and preachers, this hagiographer refrains from celebrating the Virgin's assumption into heaven and what happened to her thereafter. It's rather his intention to create a believable historical narrative, bending his sources when necessary and emphasizing her importance, not only in relation to her son, but also to the Christian community, both past and present. The life reflects the historical and religious circumstances from which it emerged, with iconoclasm perhaps provoking Epiphanios' emphasis on the reality of Christ's human incarnation, as evidenced by the Jewish background of his mother and upbringing in a lively family that included not only her, but also his stepfather Joseph and his sons and daughters by a previous marriage. But above all, the life demonstrates the growing interest in the Theotokos as an important figure not only in Christological terms, but also as a human being, a model of asceticism, and an active participant in the life of her divine Son, Jesus Christ. I've provided you with a bibliography so that you'll know a few of the sources I've been referring to. But I'll just say at this point, thank you very much, and thank you for listening. But I'll perhaps switch back to the bibliography in case anyone wants to copy anything down.
Thank you so much, Mary. This was a wonderful talk and beautifully illustrated. I think we've got a bit of time. I was particularly interested in the appearance of the risen Christ. That's quite common in early Syriac, but not in her room in Sion.
Mm.
And that's completely new to me, very intriguing. And the illustration of the Kludos is also fascinating. That's a wonderful find.
Yes.
Do you think Epiphanios, could he have taken it from, what earlier Greek sources could he have borrowed it from, or has it seeped through from Syriac tradition, where it's certainly quite prominent?
Of Christ's appearance to his
yes,
mother,
Mary is the
anywhere,
host.
not necessarily at the house.
No,
you mean?
yeah, anywhere.
Right. I think it, as in Syriac texts, I'm trying to recall. I think there is increasingly an assumption or an attempt to retell the story, especially in John, that it is for her that he appeared, not to Mary Magdalene. But I'm having trouble thinking of specific examples to give you. I was this example of him coming to the house, which Epiphanius makes so explicit in his account, seems unique to him. I've not found that in any other Greek source. And I was really intrigued by the fact that it's picked up iconographically only in those psalters, but monumental art seems to be quite conservative. I mean, it does accept, of course, the Protevangelion and the Dormition accounts and illustrates those, but only the ones that have really been accepted into the tradition. And texts like this one don't seem to make any impact on the artists or their patrons.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, in the Syriac appearances to Mary, he's always as the gardener, so it's definitely not in a domiciled context.
What you're saying is that they explicitly substitute her for Mary Magdalene, then?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And that will work with the first verses in John 21, but of course later on you get specified. So they've taken it as two separate episodes, I suppose.
Yes, right.
Yes, the two lives of West and East Syriac, Budge's East Syriac one, they're clearly related somehow. When they sort of appeared in that form, I don't know myself, and I don't think anyone really does. One interesting detail in these well, let's call them medieval Syriac lives, is the visit to Egypt. Does that appear at all in the Greek lives? The
No,
descent to Egypt. No,
possibly in the 10th century lives. I'd have to check. Not in
Mm.
Epiphanius's.
Yes, and it's attributed to Theophilus.
Hmm. I mean, one possibility for that omission, which is just a hypothesis again, is that I think people held the infancy gospel of Thomas in rather, they viewed it as very dubious in the Greek tradition.
Yes, well, it's very curious.
Statements, and tended to regard this as really heretical and to be not explored. But it was developed much more in the West, I think, and often included in the Latin lives of the Virgin.
Yes. I see time has run out. So thank you so much, Mary. This was a wonderful episode. Thank you again, and beautifully presented. And I hope we'll all get your book and read the life of Epiphanius. And goodbye to everyone till next month. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.